Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to do a video of songs the Beatles wrote about each other. It's mainly covering the solo period because they didn't really write about each other while they were together. Although there are examples such as Not Guilty, which was not released on the White Album but surfaced later, where you could say George wrote about the other three. You Never Give Me Your Money from Abbey Road, not necessarily about Lennon, but maybe commenting on the Klein situation, so that's about as close as I could come up with from the Beatles era. But as I say, mainly focusing on the solo stuff. I'm going to go chronologically, and just say at the beginning, some of these are subtle, some of them are less than subtle, some of them are somewhat speculative, but I think I'll give the benefit of the doubt to the ones I've included here that they are a reference to the other three, or one of the other three. So we'll start off with George from All Things Must Pass. So there's three songs on here which are about the other Beatles, I think. Wah Wah was the song which he wrote when he left the Beatles on January the 10th, 1969 and stormed home to Isha. I think he'd had an argument with John that day in the canteen, and he'd argued with Paul on film the day before, I think. So it was written about the Beatles in general. You made me such a big star, being there at the right time, cheaper than a dime, quite bitter. I don't need no wah-wah, and I know how sweet life can be, so I'll keep myself free of wah-wah. I'm thinking of you and all the things we used to do. It's a bit reflective and maybe a touch of sadness in there, but mainly the feeling is I don't need this stuff anymore. I'm better off on my own, and I think he was initially anyway. In fact, I think they all were. Should I say that? So then we have "Isn't It a Pity," which is quite general in its message. So I don't think it's necessarily aimed at John and Paul, but it could have been maybe aimed at the fact that he thought that John and Paul were a little bit selfish or not giving him enough time on Beatles albums. I don't know. It's more of a kind of general plea to the human race, really. But isn't it a pity, isn't it a shame how we break each other's hearts, cause each other pain, how we take each other's love without thinking any more, forgetting to give back. Isn't it a pity? So, I don't know. I think the reason this song is so timeless is because the lyric is kept general and not specific. So I think maybe that one is not so much about the other Beatles, but you can certainly, one is tempted to read stuff into the lyric there. And then I forgot to mention Run of the Mill, sorry, the third song from here, which is, again, could well have been written about John or Paul. It's not, I can't remember George in an interview ever owning up to it, but if you read the words, everyone has choice when to and not to raise their voices. It's you that decides which way you will turn. While feeling that our love's not your concern, it's you that decides. No one around you will carry the blame for you. No one around you will love you today and throw it all away tomorrow when you rise. Another day for you to realise me, send me down again. As the days stand up on end, you've got me wondering how I lost your friendship, but I see it in your eyes. Though I'm beside you, I can't carry the blame for you. I may decide to get out with your blessing while I carry on guessing. How high will you leap? Will you make enough for you to reap it? Only you arrive at your own made end, with no one but yourself to be offended. It's you that decides. Well, if it is Paul or John the source of inspiration behind that song, then we have them to thank for it, because it's a masterpiece, lyrically, musically, and just written in quite a generous spirit. He's not having a dig, he's just bemoaning the fact that it could be the end of his friendship with Paul if it is about Paul, and it's very nicely, the tone, I like the tone on that song. It's not sticking the knife in or anything like that. It's just a little bit bitter, but more kind of sad and reflective. So then we move on to Ringo. The B-side of this song, well, actually, It Don't Come Easy probably was about the Beatles split, but it wasn't necessarily written about the others, just saying the situation. But early 1970 on the B-side of here is clearly written about the other three, because there's a verse about John and there's a verse about Paul and which order is it going? I think Paul is first, lives on a farm, got plenty of charm, then John, and then George. And then when I come to town, I want to see all three. So he's at this stage, it's called early 1970, not released till 1971. At this stage, he's wanting to bring about a reconciliation. So in that sense, it's a very nice example of solo songs, a solo Beatles song written about the others. Then we have probably approaching the low point of relations between John and Paul, first starting off with Ram. The messages on here were subliminal, or maybe not even there at all, and John read a lot into some of the songs, like Dear Boy, he thought was about him, and apparently it was about Linda's first husband. And then, lines on Backseat of My Car, we believe we can't be wrong. John took that as a kind of statement from Paul that he's right about everything. Too many people, I don't know, yeah, that's the one song that Paul has admitted to. Too many people preaching practices, don't let them tell you what you want to be. Fairly harmless stuff, really. But the real dig on this album, to me, is this back cover photograph of two Beatles copulating. If anyone was left in any doubt as to what Paul was angry about, then that picture sums it up for me, and I think it's in pretty poor taste. And I'm not surprised John reacted. Although we know the result of that reaction is How Do You Sleep? On here, very specifically written about McCartney. You don't need to be a Beatle brain of Britain to work this one out. A pretty face may last a year or two, but pretty soon we'll see what you can do. The sound you make is music to my ears. You must have learnt something in all those years. The only thing you've done was yesterday. And since you're gone, you're just another day. I mean, it's relentless, it's vicious, it's unpleasant, but it's a brilliant song. And it probably would have been a timeless classic had the lyric been kept a little bit more general. As it is, it's dated a little bit. It's always brings back sadness for Beatles fans to listen to it. But every time I do listen to it, I can't but admire the musicianship and the guitar solo from George Harrison. And it's brilliantly sung by John. So it's unfortunate, but interesting historical anecdote, in the solo years, to have that spat between John and Paul. Luckily they made up at the end of that year. And Paul's response at the end of that year, December the 8th, 1971, on this album, Wildlife, was to include Dear Friend as the last track. Dear friend, what's the time? Is this really the borderline? Does it really mean so much to you? Are you afraid, or is it true? It was very much an olive branch from Paul. He could have replied in kind to How Do You Sleep and started, the mother of all ding-dongs in public. I mean, they did have a ding-dong in Melody Maker, replying to each other and stuff, but thankfully on record, Paul took what I think was the sensible route and gritted his teeth and just extended that beautiful olive branch of Dear Friend. And John cannot have been anything but moved when he heard that, I guess. I haven't heard him comment about it, but he may have not liked much of Wildlife, but I'm sure he was moved by that track. It's a nice one, Paul. Then we move on to Ringo. Back off Boogaloo. Now, I didn't know this recently. Apparently this is aimed at Paul. Boogaloo apparently was a nickname Paul went by in the 60s for the other three. I didn't really know that. I guess the line, get yourself together, give me something tasty. Everything you try to do, no, it sure sounds wasted. Could well be aimed at Paul's solo career, because Ringo's on record at the time saying he didn't like Ram, not one worthwhile tune on it, he said. He didn't like McCartney. He actually said, I feel Paul is wasting his time. Maybe in retrospect he's revised his opinion, but even if it is a dig at Paul, it's a pretty harmless one, and Back Off Boogaloo, it's quite generic. And most people didn't know it was about Paul, so even if it was, I don't think it did much harm. Paul and Ringo they had met together socially at Mick Jagger's wedding in the summer of '71, so they were on speaking terms, but and I think obviously the following year Paul contributed to the Ringo album, and so did the other three. So, I mean, if this was a dig at Paul, as I say, pretty harmless, pretty light in its tone. And then we get this album from George, which is mostly spiritual stuff. But there's one track on here called "Sue Me, Sue You Blues," which is about the Apple court case. You know, with Paul taking the others to court, and it's quite. I know not everyone likes this track, Thomas Called, and you don't much like it, but I think it's quite interesting to have this track on an otherwise very religious album, to have this track which is so obviously about money and getting screwed by lawyers, a very material world song. And it's affidavit swearing time, sign it on the dotted line, hold your Bible in your hand, now all that's left is to find yourself a new band. Yeah. Hold the block on money flow, move it into joint escrow. Court receiver laughs and thrills, but in the end we just pay those lawyers their bills. So I think that's quite an amusing take on the Beatles. I don't know if amusing's the right word, but it's not that bitter. It's quite humorous, I think, and good slide guitar on there. And then Living in Material World, the title track, has this mention of Paul. Met them all here in the material world. John and Paul here in the material world. Though we started out quite poor, we got Richie on a tour. Got caught up in the material world. So he was having a dig at, you know, all the money they earned and how it didn't equate to spiritual fulfillment. But, you know, George was not giving away his mansion, although he did give generously to charity over the years. He was quite happy to be a millionaire, I think. So, anyway, that contradiction had always been with George, you know, having too much money versus being spiritually fulfilled. John as well, probably. And then we got from Band on the Run, again, I'm not sure if Paul has really admitted that Let Me Roll It was a tribute to John, but it's very hard to ignore the similarity between the guitar on Let Me Roll It to the guitar on Cold Turkey and the Plastic Ono Band type style. And also the lyrics. I can't tell you how I feel. My heart is like a wheel, let me roll it to you. Very tempting for Beatles fans at the time to see it as an olive branch, again, a further olive branch to John. And they were to be reconciled and meet up socially in the beginning of 1974. So, and then there's a little primal scream at the end of the track. So, and then at the end of 1985, there's some kind of moaning, a bit like Cold Turkey, the end of Cold Turkey. So, quite playful. If it is a tribute to John, it's a heartfelt one, and gone is the bitterness, thank God. Beatles fans rejoiced in the fact that the four members were on good terms with each other, and they very nearly considered a reunion in '74. And then we got this album, which contains Not Guilty, which had previously been a White Album reject, but it's quite obvious that the words are about the Beatles, the other Beatles. Not guilty for looking like a freak, making friends with every Sikh. Not guilty for leading you astray on the road to Mandalay. I won't upset the apple cart, I only want what I can get. I'm really sorry that you've been misled, but like you heard me said, I'm not guilty. By the time it appeared on here, it doesn't sound angry at all. On the White Album demo, it's quite an angry, not angry, but somber song with some minor chord guitar. And on here, it's a kind of breezy, almost loving song, really, even though the words are, he didn't change the words. So that was Not Guilty. And then after John died, we had a couple of tributes. We had, all those years ago from George, which appeared on here, which is a very nice song. It apparently was written for Ringo, and recorded with, I'm not sure if Ringo did a vocal, but he certainly laid down a drum track. And then John died, and George quickly rewrote the words and recorded his own vocal and got Paul and Linda to contribute, and George Martin to help with the production. So it was the closest to a Beatles reunion we'd had since I'm the Greatest in '73. And then on this album, on the Somewhere in England album, there's a track called Writings on the Wall, which contains the line talking about losing your friends. And all the time you thought it would last, your life, your friends would always be, till they're drunk away, or shot away, or die away from you. Now, this album was released in 1981, so one is tempted to think that reference to Shot Away was a reference to John. But, looking at the chronology, it was included in this 1980 version of Summer in England, rejected by Warner Brothers. Writings on the Wall is here. So I'm thinking this song was a reference to Mal Evans getting shot by the LA police rather than John, although it was eerily ironic that lyric was in there. And I guess it applies to every friend who's been shot, but when Bob Marley was shot around the same time as well. But I think when this album came out, when that song was recorded, I don't think John had died, so that's quite interesting. And then Paul came up with his tribute here today, which is just a glorious, heartfelt tribute. It's always a shame when it takes someone to die before you lay down your true feelings and say how much you love them, or to say that you love them at all, really. So that was one of the highlights of Tug of War. Really brilliant and very emotional whenever he does it in concert these days. And then Ringo did a tribute to George called Never Without You, a few years after George passed, which was also very nice. Eric Clapton's guesting on the guitar. So that was my video about Beatles writing about each other. I think it's been an interesting journey. Most of it's water under the bridge, and some of it's acrimonious, some of it's the opposite and very loving, but all of it interesting, fascinating for Beatles fans. Thank you for watching. See you next time.